Hey, Ralph. Adrian, how are you?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can share now if you like.
Okay. Cool.
How are you? Oh man, you grew a beard, just like
Yeah, I'm
me.
good. Um, yeah, I've had lots of work lately, so I did a shorter presentation than I did last time.
No problem, no problem. As
Yeah.
much as, we will always like to have different presenters. So thank you so much. It's going to be discussion, so people are going to discuss and it's going to extend. How's life?
Okay. Um, yeah, very busy. Like,
So you started your own startup firm, I heard?
no, no. I'm just working in
Mhm.
the same startup I used to be working before, but um,
So just to give you an update, last
yeah.
Sunday, somebody hacked into our meeting. And
Oh, really?
yeah, and they were basically they were basically typing all these annotations that were inappropriate. Calling people names and racial epithet and all that stuff. So I basically stopped. People cannot annotate on the group anymore. So so they cannot type on here or anything like that. So hopefully this would help. Also, I implemented a password so people cannot go in without a password and stuff like that. So,
Oh, I thought we had a password already.
no, it used to be I used to admit everybody from the, I guess it's like a chat room. And once you enter the chat room, I will admit you. But apparently, this hacker, I don't know it. I don't think it was one of my part of our group. The guy just was able to hack to some device, and even though last time it was a horrible attack. We did it 4 times. We got out, got back in. I implemented a password, and he was able to get back in, and he was typing all this nasty stuff. It's
Oh,
horrible.
really?
It was really bad. I mean, I was,
Okay.
yeah,
Well, okay. I hope he doesn't show up again. Mm.
yeah. So it's nice you were able to Solzhenitsyn. I see Solzhenitsyn.
Ah, yeah. Put his face there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Big deal.
It's a huge book. It's very big.
Did you
Um,
finish it? Did you finish it?
Now
Oh,
I'm
he's
in the middle. I read maybe 30%. I'm at the episode where he talks about the trials of the engineers.
oh
So
wow.
the engineers are tried, and the prosecutor, who knows nothing about what they do, asks them like high school level questions, and then uses the answers against them in uh, like almost a surreal way.
Right.
Like if the ceiling is too high, it's wrecking. If the ceiling is too low, it's also wrecking. If the ceiling of the factory is, yeah, I mean it's just ridiculous. Like
Yeah.
for instance, whenever they try to do anything for the workers, like put ventilation in the factories,
Mhm.
um, it could be used against you in the trial because the prosecutor would say that you are tying up capital in the for the purpose of slowing down the socialist revolution.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. It's pretty. I mean, if they want to prosecute you, they didn't need any reason to do it.
Yeah, but they actually had a criminal code, and yeah, I mean, the thing that kind of surprises me about the book is that the system could go on for so long, because you would imagine at some point that people would be fed up and they would revolt or something.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. People don't know that, but the whole Russian, you know, prison code on the side of the prisoners was created from Gulag. And even though there was a lot of intelligentsia was in there, but the words like suka and all that stuff, it was created all in Gulag area. And you know, the sukas was the people that rebelled against the government, and therefore, and they were also traitors. You know, they basically was a double agent. So throughout the Russian prisons, they had sukas, and they had also the people that they used to call them the made man, right? The made man, you know, had
the NEP man. Is
correct.
It, yeah.
They had a three Kremlins on the back, you know, tattooed on the back. And so if they had those three things, they were the made man, and you know, they used to call them vor v zakone, you know, or the thief in law.
Wow.
And you know, this all came from Gulag, and people, you know, like there's a documentaries all over the internet, and that's even though it was intelligentsia that was there, but they came up with all this stuff. And then, you know, at some point this traders took over in prison code and became more famous than those thieves in law and stuff like that. So I'm waiting for people. I messed up actually on Meetup. I put 6 o'clock today. I should have put 7, but on the Zoom it was 7. I have so many presentations, 3 a week, and I, you know, sometimes I mess up. And also with this whole hacking thing, I got my life was messed up a little bit. Didn't know how to secure this thing.
Oh, okay. So maybe some people will not show up because of the time problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say we're live now. Yes, people are popping now.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm gonna announce it that we're live. I'm gonna send the notification.
Evening, Zach.
Hey, how are you, sir?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Mark? Good. Yeah. We'll miss half. I posted 6 for some reason. It's at 7. So a lot of people that signed up may not be able to join.
That's all right. It's 6 o'clock for me. You got it right for one person.
I knew it. I knew it was, you know, Chicago time, Central time.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your thinking of me.
Here we go. Were you here on Sunday?
You talking to me?
Yeah.
Was I here? What do you mean on Sunday?
Present in our presentation for Atsekas. We had a
No, I missed it. No.
Well, you didn't miss much. We rescheduled it. We had a hacking attack.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I remember hearing about that. I don't know what happened though.
What happened is people have nothing else to do. They, you know, they're attacking a history group now. How messed up is that?
I know, that's pretty pathetic.
Yeah, I know. This is not like a CEO of some .com. I mean, this is nothing really. I mean, I'm not charging you money for this. Who are you attacking?
So what specifically happened?
Well, they were writing the racial slurs and anti-Semitic slurs on the presentation.
On the presentation?
Yeah, basically Sergio was presenting, and this guy hacked into it and was able to annotate inside the Zoom. So I took that privilege now. I deleted nobody can type on it now. You can only and no longer type.
But from now on, we'll have these passcodes, right?
And then we'll have passcodes, yeah, which I think people are having issues with right now and can't get in. I'm afraid to post the passcode. Then the next thing you know, this idiot is going to read it and, you know, and start attacking us somehow. But people are asking for passcodes.
Yeah, I told you. You should have sent it to all of them again.
I did. I just did again.
I know, but you know, not everybody savvy with this.
No, I just did it right now again.
Oh, you did send it again? Oh, okay.
Paul is just asking for a passcode. I messed up. What are you gonna do? You know, you create security and then you lose people. You know what? Screw this, because nobody can annotate anyway. Let me just do passcode here.
You don't share. You want to share passcode?
Yeah, fuck it. That is what it is. It is what it is.
Man, what a pain in the ass that is. The passcode.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what happened last time. Man, we got hacked.
Well, what's the downside of being hacked? I mean, do people come on yelling and screaming or showing you pictures of their behind?
Yeah, they overtyping the screen with all
They
kind
were
of
typing
slurs and
racial and racist
shape.
words, yeah, and calling people by name and stuff.
Great. Man,
I had to stop the meeting 4 times. I stopped.
God bless the assholes.
It was horrible.
Nope.
I'm posting it. Fuck it. All right. I mean, you know, if you want to start, Hadrian.
it's only 7 minutes. Usually people get later. Yeah, but yeah, we could start and then you send
I just did.
as people ask password. You send it. But I don't know.
Okay.
Go ahead, Hadrian. Sorry.
Okay, so this presentation is about the Gulag Archipelago, which is a famous book that was written by a Soviet survivor of the Gulags. And this book had a lot of impact in the world because it was basically the first, like the most detailed account of a Gulag survivor that existed up to then. And it really morally condemned the Soviet Union, and it exposed its crimes to millions of people because the book sold millions of copies. And also, interestingly enough, this book was written by, like by the time this book came out, Solzhenitsyn was already the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is kind of interesting because you would think that people that received the Nobel Prize would be at the peak of their career or maybe later. But this book is the most famous book of Solzhenitsyn, and it came after he received the Nobel Prize. So maybe that's why it circulated so much. And this book was extremely difficult to make because of censorship, because the only way that Solzhenitsyn had to make this book was in secret. He wrote it when he was in the Soviet Union, and he had to talk to hundreds, literally hundreds of survivors to piece together the story. So yeah, first I'm going to talk a little bit about Solzhenitsyn himself. So Solzhenitsyn was born of an Ukrainian mother and a Russian father in the USSR, I think around 1918. Yeah. And at first he studied mathematics, but then he studied philosophy, literature, history, and he got really indoctrinated into communism when he was at university. So this is very interesting because Solzhenitsyn is known as one of the most famous critics of communism, but he was a fervent communist up until he went into the camps. So in fact, even in his book, he tells about times when he's talking to other prisoners in the Lubyanka prison where he went when he was arrested. And at the time, he was still a communist. So he still believed that his sacrifice was worth it, at least partially. So during the World War II, he was a sound ranging artillery officer, which is sound ranging is like a mathematical way of knowing where an enemy gun is by measuring, by doing trigonometry and like measuring the difference in time that you measure a gun that's firing at you with multiple microphones. So this was something he was very good at because he was, a mathematics student, and he got decorated for his achievements. And in fact, he was arrested while he was still in the Red Army. So as he was advancing into Europe with his men and winning battle after battle, because it was in 1945, he was arrested literally for sending a letter to a friend where he was just saying that the collective farms didn't seem to work as well as what you could read in the press, and for basically just slight criticism of Stalin. And it's really stupid when you think about it, because he knew that all of his correspondence was obviously being monitored because he was a soldier, and everything the soldiers sent was read by the secret police. But when he was arrested, like many citizens in the Soviet Union, he really had no idea of what happened after you are arrested. So that's an important point, because that's where the title of the book comes from. The archipelago, the idea of the archipelago is that it is remote. It's completely remote from real life. And once you get arrested, so most people got a 10-year sentence or a 25-year sentence. And, usually you would just die in the Gulag. And the people that were arrested, even if they didn't die, they were oftentimes prevented from communicating with their family. So they were essentially dead. Like you're living with your parents or your wife or something, and then she gets arrested and you never see her again and you never hear from her again. So it's basically as if she was dead. And if she dies, it's not like you're going to receive a letter telling you that she's dead. In fact, the people that got arrested, sometimes they would be told by the interrogators that if they did not cooperate, meaning if they did not sign a fake confession, the interrogators would just kill them and say to their family that they had been arrested without rights of correspondence. So that's why Solzhenitsyn was so careless with his letter sending, because he didn't know at all what happened in the Gulag, because obviously the press was censored and the people in the Gulag were not able to talk to the outside world. So entering the Gulag is like entering into another dimension almost. And he was arrested under Article 58, which is a very, which I will talk about later, but essentially for just criticizing Stalin, he was arrested under a terrorism charge that was aggravated because it was an organization, because two people was enough to apply the organization penalty in the Soviet Criminal Code, which had the specificity of not differentiating between intention and action. So if you said something like, oh, I dislike the Soviet government, then that could be construed as intention of committing a terrorist act. And because intention is the same as action, you got the same penalty for criticizing the Soviet government as a spy would have had in the beginning of the USSR. Because the trend you can see in the book is that the sentences that people received would, at first, in the first criminal code, people would receive like 3 years in Gulag. But then as time went on, the sentences became bigger and bigger. And
Adrian,
yes.
could I just make a little comment? We just passed that letter, but I just want to say that in that letter also he criticized the Soviet army, the way they treated civilians, because he witnessed a few gang rapes. And he was very upset about that. And he wrote how civilians were treated in Prussia in particular. by the Soviet army, and that was obviously a very dangerous thing to do. Sorry, I just thought it was an important detail.
Was he just naive?
Naive? No. He didn't think that it was specifically criticism. It was about some people, some soldiers. He was upset about that, and he wrote about this. But maybe he was naive a little bit at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So he did 8 years of Gulag because of that one letter, and after the 8 years, he renounced his communist faith, and he became more of a nationalist Russian Orthodox that believed still that, like, it's a bit strange. Like, I saw one of his speeches at Harvard where he says that at the same time that he dislikes intensely the USSR, he does not like the capitalist model. So he's kind of I really don't know how to define his new political leanings, except that he's kind of more moved by faith, I guess, after the Gulag than ideology. Also, after going through the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn also survived cancer. And so he went through Gulag and then cancer. And after that, he started writing enough books that were disliked by the Soviet system that he got finally exiled.
Yeah, and Adrian, one of the works, I don't know if you mentioned, it's called Cancer Ward, that basically comes from his own experience about treatment. He was lucky to, with all those primitive treatment, they still used already some treatments, but he was lucky to survive. Many people died, and I don't know if you read that book. I have. It's pretty, gruesome conditions, and it was actually published before his Nobel Prize. So it was probably one day of Ivan Denisovich. That was the first one, and then also Cancer Word. Those were the basis probably for the Nobel Prize.
We know what cancer it was.
Yeah, I can check. I think it's. Wait, I can check. Maybe it's.
I don't remember. Maybe lung cancer. I'm not sure.
I would have
Oh,
thought
usually beat lung cancer. So
I don't know. I don't know.
there's not really such a thing as a mild cancer.
No, it was not mild. It's just he responded to the treatment, radiation treatment. That's all they used. I don't think they had chemotherapy at the time, but he was lucky to respond to the treatment. It went in remission. But a lot of people.
I think he had an incredible force of will, because to survive everything he went through and then to go on and win the Nobel Prize, it's extremely unlikely that someone like Solzhenitsyn would have ended up writing books about his story. In fact, he talks about, before Solzhenitsyn himself was arrested, hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, had already been arrested. And most of them would just become mute after the Gulag. Maybe it's just that most of the first waves were not really educated people. And yeah, I don't know why exactly.
No, it's not about not being educated. It's that he wrote basically to the army staff, because he wanted this to stop. He actually wanted them to be aware. He thought that the generals are not aware of what's going on, and he wanted to stop the mass rapes and killing of civilians. And he thought that as a communist, that it's his duty to do. He never thought that it would be considered to be, anti-Soviet. And as a matter of fact, they did take precautions. They brought out some laws. The Marshal Rokossovsky, who was actually later on defense minister, he is the one who they issued that there will be the soldiers will be shot if they would be found guilty of rape or anything like that, or murder. So he did make a difference, but apparently was considered to be disloyal. I mean, but that's why he did. I mean, I know that my parents lived through this time, and grandparents, and everybody knew that people disappear. It happened so often that everybody knew that it was time that everybody was scared. But then he went through the war, and he thought that he's doing a good thing for the good cause, to help communist movement, just to correct something. It was nothing against Soviets or nothing anti government, nothing anti-Stalin necessarily. It was just purely for that.
Oh yeah, so the amount of people in the Gulag system was truly incredible. So I think it's estimated that the Gulag, like 18 million people went through the Gulag. And at its peak, it had between 12 and 15 million people, which is crazy when you think about it, because so Russia today is 150 million. So of course you had to take into account that the USSR was bigger than Russia, but at the time of Stalin, the USSR was probably maybe around 150 million as well, because the population peaked and then came down. Yeah, I think it peaked around, well, I don't remember, but it peaked over 200 million and then went down. So just roughly, you had about 10% people in the USSR that were in the Gulag under Stalin, which is insane. It's crazy.
But not at one time, right?
Well, at the peak, when it had 15 million people dispersed in hundreds of camps, that would have been a large percentage of the population. So maybe not 10%, maybe it would have been only 7%, but it's still massive. Like, yeah, I just find that to be very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, they had basically what happened is a lot of people, when the Russians occupied, when they divided with Hitler and they occupied part of the Eastern Europe before the war, a lot of people from Poland went to Gulag system. And then it was considered to be, if you were if you were captured by the Germans and then either ran away or were later on, after the war, you were considered potential spy. So most of those people also went to Gulag right away, and then of course, anybody could report on anybody, and just bring the suspicion. That would be enough to have them arrested. It was basically massive. So I think 10% is at least, maybe more.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that's crazy is that any other nation in the world would welcome back its prisoners of war except the USSR. The USSR literally jailed its own prisoners of war when they came back from the German camps, where, by the way, they were treated in the worst possible manner. And the reason why is because the USSR did not ratify the, I think it's the Geneva Convention.
Geneva
Yeah.
Convention. Yeah.
So because the USSR did not ratify the Geneva Convention, their prisoners did not receive help from the Red Cross, because the USSR would literally intercept, would prevent them, the Red Cross people, from supplying their camps. And they died in massive numbers. The USSR prisoners in the German camps.
Were
So-
they located in Siberia or throughout Russia or what?
Throughout
Yeah.
Russia, Siberia, but also northern part of European part of Russia. You know, the famous one called Solovki, which is in a White Sea. You know.
Yeah. I found a map actually. Do you see it right now?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So every dot is a gulag. So yeah, I mean, it's
Wow.
pretty much everywhere, except there's like a zone that doesn't have any gulags, but yeah.
There are no people living there.
Yeah. It's just too expensive to carry them over there. Yeah.
You think that at that time that the central government, Stalin, etc., was actually really in charge? Did he have power, or had the sort of power run away from the official government?
No, they had absolute
No.
power.
Yeah.
Stalin
It was actually
had
like-
absolute power.
Yeah, and also one thing that's crazy is that so the judiciary was literally talking to the the 5-year plan committee or whatever, but basically the minister of the economy was giving directives as to how long they should imprison people for, so that their slave labor could be used towards achieving the 5-year plan. So as the demands of the 5-year plan became more and more of a stress on the economy, literally, like in a completely arbitrary manner, the people that were arrested for the same crime would serve like 3 years at the beginning of the Gulag period and 25 years at the end, just because they needed their labor for economic planning.
But people did come out of the Gulag.
Yes.
Oh, but they would get rearrested. So actually, he talked about people that served, like the first batch of people that served 10 years in the Gulag. When they came out, they had like a little bit of freedom, like a couple of months. And then someone in the central government decided to rearrest them literally without trial for no reason. And they were so broken psychologically after 10 years that they didn't even have to arrest them. They just told them to show up at the police station and they came on their own.
Yeah. The most of the people came out after the death of Stalin. At the time of Khrushchev, what's the thaw, this like melting, kind of considered to be the period of melt, meaning that it became loosen up. I mean, the terror, but yeah, at that time, there is no really recourse. Even right now in Russia, Putin can order anything, and the court will just go the order. There is no, government can intervene in any procedure and just order the judge what to do. There's no independent court system whatsoever, never been in Soviet times. So they govern everything. It's Stalin doesn't have to be involved in every. He just gives directions. If you're arrested, you're already guilty. It's probably like 90%. If you're arrested, 90%, that
Oh,
you're
no,
going
no,
to
it's
be convicted?
wait. So there's an anecdote in the book where they made in the 40s, they made a revision to the criminal code, another one, because they were constantly making revisions to the criminal code. And in the revision that they made in the 40s, they had to redo it because they had forgotten to put any mention of acquittal in the code. So they did a criminal code where there was no provision under which you could be acquitted of your crime. And then they realized their mistake because at some point, someone told them, oh, maybe we should add a provision for acquittal, even if we never use it. And so, yeah.
Did after Solzhenitsyn got out, did he have his books published in the Soviet Union?
He had one, yeah, he had, I think, A Day in the Life of
Yeah.
Denisovich was published.
Ivan Denisovich, yeah. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Cancer Ward. They were published during the Khrushchev time, before 1970. But then now things are published after the Gorbachev. But prior to that, I read Archipelago Gulag when I was in Russia, like in 70s, through Samizdat, which is illegal. You could go to jail for reading it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so there's multiple waves. That's kind of a theme of the book. The book is so the style in which the book is written is very compelling because instead of giving historical, like chronological progression, it's a lot of parentheses where sometimes he has a philosophical tone, sometimes he has a more like moralist tone, but usually throughout the book he has like a neutral but slightly sarcastic tone. And he gives lots of anecdotes of what happened to particular people. And his chapters are in themes. So you have one chapter where he talks about how the arrests were made. He has a chapter where he talks about some of the big trials, etc. So yeah, it's very interesting. And some of his chapters talk about particular waves of arrests. So the way it worked is that you constantly had people being arrested and sent to Gulag, but you had some spikes. You had periods where a lot of people would be arrested at once. And for instance, you had three main spikes. The first one was during the collectivization, where they arrested entire villages that refused to collectivize. And after that, they arrested literally millions of so-called kulaks. So people that were, so a kulak was essentially like if you had a village, like a poor village, the kulak would be the man who has 3 cows or the guy who has a roof on his head that's slightly in better condition than his neighbor. And literally millions of kulaks were arrested. And also after these waves, you had like repeat waves, because once they had arrested a lot of people in one of the waves, then a few years later, they would come and arrest the relatives of these people. So, and essentially you could be arrested even like just for for instance, if your father had been arrested in the first wave, there was a high probability that you would be arrested in a subsequent wave.
You would be politically unreliable considered. And I just wanted to mention that why they call the rich peasants, they call them rich peasants, kulaks. Kulak means feast. And that's how they call them symbolically, that he is hiding something of his own inside his feast. So that was the name given of them. So kulak in Russian means feast.
And of course, they had there was a great purge in the 30s of officials by Stalin. So this is the purge in which, for instance, 95% of the leadership of the Red Army was purged. And some of the closest collaborators of Stalin got purged. And a lot of people in the party. And after that, you had all the prisoners of wars that came back from Germany that got rearrested and sent to the Gulag. But you also
Why?
had,
I mean, if you were a POW, that doesn't show any disrespect or anything.
Yeah, because the directive was that you don't allow to be captured. You kill yourself before you get
Oh.
captured. That was the directive. When you get captured, that means you're coward. And the second, you're a potential spy because you could be turned while in captivity. That was two reasons, yeah.
But there's also another reason, like he talks at one point about so you had the crew of a USSR submarine that was captured, and they spent the war in, what's it called? When you're arrested in a house arrest in Sweden. And so they spent the war in Sweden, where they got to see like what a capitalist country was like. And so when they came back, they were immediately arrested because, well, actually, no, when they came back, they managed to stay free for a while. But then an article came out about them because some reporters had heard of them or something. And so when it became known that these people existed, they got arrested and sent to the Gulag. And why? I mean, the reason why they got sent to the Gulag was not so much because they were spy, but because they saw something that they shouldn't tell to other people. And after that, articles came out in the Western press talking about their case. And Solzhenitsyn explains that after these articles came out, the Soviet government took these people out of the camps, fed them for 10 days, gave them new clothes, and put them in front of journalists for a press conference where they lied. They said that they had read in the newspapers that they were being slandered by the West, when of course no one in the USSR could buy a Western newspaper. And they said that everything was fine and they were well treated, etc. And then as soon as the conference ended, they put their Gulag clothes back on and they were sent to the Gulag back again. So, yeah, so the motivation for arresting people was sometimes just because they had gone abroad and they came back with too much knowledge.
Are any of these places tourist sites now, as other atrocity sites in Europe are now open for tourism?
No.
I would think so.
Not
No.
in Russia. No.
Oh.
Wait, really? No, look, look at this. You can find some gulags to visit, I think. Siberian gulags and Soviet exile sites.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be preserved as a site to show how people lived and what they did, you know. You could probably go to this town and see some buildings, but
yeah,
not a common thing to do.
You could probably go to the Solovetsky Islands.
Yeah, to the island, yeah, but I don't know. I don't know what you could see there.
Yeah, I don't know if it's maintained. I mean, oh yeah, so these are anecdotes. So the first one is in the first pages. It really shocked me when I read it the first time. So it's a woman whose neighbor gets arrested, and the entire family gets arrested except for a small child that's very little. And so she takes the child and she goes to the police station and asks, what should I do with this child? And the police station had quotas of people that they needed to arrest. And because it was the end of the month and they didn't have enough people to send, I don't know, to make an arrest or something, they just arrested her on the spot and they sent her to the Gulag. Another is, at one point, there's a man who's arrested, and just before his arrest, his son died. And so he has a tiny coffin for his son. And because the police was very, like they had instructions to search everything. They searched the coffin of his son and they dumped it. Then there's another one, which is, I mean, there's so many anecdotes about interrogators, but most of them are really disgusting. Like, you know, interrogators that revel in inventing torture techniques, and you know, some of them were just really sadists, like really the worst people. Yeah, so, and there's this anecdote really shocked me as well. So it's a GPU officer that learned that all ethnic Chinese would be arrested, and he had married for love a wife that was ethnically Chinese, and so, you know, in order to survive, perhaps he arrested her, but instead of arresting her because she was ethnic Chinese, he made up a different case instead, and so he got rid of his wife before the order to arrest all ethnic Chinese came. And because of that sacrifice, he later got promoted. And then I think the worst one I read was the gold wave. So in 1928, the Soviet government arrested people that they suspected had been NEP men. So what's the NEP? The NEP is the new economic policy. And what it was at the beginning of the Soviet Union, they realized that they did not have the political capital and power to collectivize everything at once. And so they allowed capitalism in the countryside, but they had communism in cities. But Stalin put an end to the NEP because the NEP was not a communist institution. And so during the NEP, some people managed to hire workers, like successful peasants would go to the market, they would hire a worker to carry the grain or something. And so in 1928, they went through the people that had hired other people during the NEP, and they assumed that they were hoarding gold, and they tortured them until they could provide some gold. And this is terrible. Like they would be tortured, burned, steamed. I mean, yeah. And the thing is, even if you had gold, so if you had no gold, they would just torture you to death. But if you had gold, and you gave your gold too late, they would give you a prison sentence just out of spite. And if you gave your gold too soon, they would think you had more gold, so they would still torture you. So this really, yeah, I mean, there's hundreds of anecdotes. This is just to give you a taste of the type of stuff you can read in the book. One thing I found very interesting in the book was the description of the criminal code. So if you wanted, so this is a very interesting case, because if you wanted to design the criminal code of a dictatorship, like, how would you design it? And it seems to me that the best way would be to have short code. That way you can arrest people for the same crime again and again. So you don't have to, like, it optimizes the time you spend arresting and charging people, because you only have like 2 or 3 articles. Then you also want a code that is extremely vague. So you want the articles to be so large that you can arrest anyone under any one of these articles. And you want the punishment to be not a death sentence. You want instead to punish them to become slaves, because that way you can use their slave labor. And you want to put on them the highest possible slave sentence you can. And this is literally exactly what the USSR criminal code was. It was a code that was extremely short, so it was optimized to sentence people. Like, what you have to realize is that they didn't have open trials for most cases. The open trials were just for show. just to show something to the press. But most trials would be decided by a secret committee of 3 people. And these 3 people had they literally had printed papers, printed forms, where you had something like Article 58, Section 3, 10 years. And they would have a stack of these papers, and then they would wait to receive the names of the people that the organs had arrested. And they would simply type the name of the prisoner in the form and send it along. Like it was like the justice system in the USSR was just simply optimized to process people and give them a sentence immediately. And even though on paper, it was written in the code that you could not torture a prisoner, for instance, or it was written that a prisoner had a right to a lawyer, or it was written that a prisoner had a right to complain about the conditions in which he was being held. But in practice, no one knew the code but the interrogators. So the prisoners were not even aware that they had a right to protest. And even if they had wanted to protest, there was just a culture where, you had no one to charge you. There was no appeal. If you got arrested, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't call anyone. There was no press to report on what was happening on you. It was essentially, you were being crushed by the system if you got arrested. You had no hope. And even though you had no hope, what's interesting is that some people resisted the pressure. So for instance, Solzhenitsyn recalls that when the Soviet government tried to arrest all of the engineers, they had a tough time at the beginning because some of the most prominent engineers that they would arrest would literally die under torture rather than sign a fake confession. So this is like almost a biblical case study on how people can survive under torture. It's, if you ever wondered if people can survive under the worst possible circumstances and not give in to any torture, what happened in the USSR is a perfect example. So it was a minority of people, but some people literally had enough force of will to do it. And one thing that Solzhenitsyn is proud of is that he did not denounce anyone else while he was being arrested. But the goal of the process, of course, for the interrogator was to obtain more names to arrest from each prisoner. So it was really like an unending process because they would arrest people, torture them until they gave them names, and then arrest the people in the list, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so one thing I want to do is I just want to show you the criminal code, what the criminal code looked like. So yeah, so you see this, so this is literally 2 pages, okay? And these 2 pages arrested millions of people in the USSR. And so this is the famous Article 58. And so Article 58 it's under Article 58.10 that Solzhenitsyn was arrested. So Solzhenitsyn was arrested for propaganda or agitation containing a call for the overthrow, subversion, or weakening of Soviet authority, or for the carrying out of other counter-revolutionary crimes. So what's incredible in this code is that essentially anything that aims at weakening the Soviet authority is a crime. But does criticizing the Soviet authority, is that not a way to weaken the Soviet authority? Well, yes. So under Article 58.10, anything you say, if you talk to your wife about something you don't like about the current regime, 58.10. If you give out flyers saying that Stalin is a monster and he should be replaced, that's 58.10. There's literally no difference between these 2 acts in the Soviet code. And here you have a minimum sentence that you don't have any maximum sentence. So someone could be arrested under 5810 and he could be sentenced for 25 years. What's also very interesting is that this criminal code created a special class of citizens. So basically in this code, in all of these articles, you do not have, how do you call it? You don't have normal crimes. Like you don't have murder, you don't have theft. That's in another section of the code. And actually the people that were arrested for murder and theft, they were better treated in the Gulag than the people that were arrested for political crimes, which are the people arrested under Article 58. And in fact, you even had many people that worked in the justice system of the USSR had been criminals under the Tsar. So you had like famous prosecutors that literally had been arrested for murder under the Tsar, but because of the revolution, they were seen as having been part of an oppressed, marginalized group of people pushed to break the bourgeois law. And everything that existed about the Tsarist legal system was thrown away and replaced because of the communist ideology. So for instance, here you don't have any difference between intention and action because and you also don't have any difference between means and like, for instance, if you gather means to do something, or if you do something in a normal legal system, it's different, but in this legal system, it's not. Also, another thing that's very important about this legal system is that this was created, this is the legacy of Lenin, because Solzhenitsyn takes a very, like, he very cautiously and very systematically mentions letters that came from Lenin and quotes that Lenin gave that he could find in the newspaper, and all the elements that show that Lenin was in fact the beginning of this system of repression and not Stalin, because Solzhenitsyn was concerned with showing that there was that Lenin was not somehow exempt of blame for what happened in the USSR, which is a criticism that was leveled against the people that spoke against the USSR in the time of Stalin. So people would say something like, oh, but Stalin betrayed the revolution. He betrayed the ideals of Lenin. Like journalists in like the New York Times would say something like, most historians would say that the legacy of Lenin is ambiguous. This was a very common point, but Solzhenitsyn shows that this code of law literally came from Lenin. So, for instance, at one point, when the SRs, which are the Socialist Revolutionaries, which was another left-wing political party under the Tsar that fought side to side with the Bolsheviks. When the SRs got tried under the USSR, Lenin specifically asked Gorky to find a way to frame what they were doing as collaboration with the international bourgeoisie. And this was a technique that was used later in like the Great Purge of Stalin. The Great Show Trials was to, whenever you arrested someone, try to show that in fact he was part of an international conspiracy, even when he was not. Another thing is Lenin asked for the execution to be more widespread. Like when he saw the first version of the code, Lenin said, no, this is not good enough. We need to shoot people for more offenses. And so the number of articles that were punished by execution was doubled from 6 to 12 because of Lenin. Another thing is when Lenin saw the first draft of this code, he said that the articles were too specific. So he said the articles had to be wider and more, like they had to allow for more power to the justice system to prosecute the enemies of the revolution. And when the second draft came, it was after Lenin had had his first stroke. And after his first stroke, Lenin was never the same. Like he was on the decline. And essentially this, Solzhenitsyn shows that this piece of law was one of the legacies of Lenin because it was drafted as he was dying, according to the recommendations that he gave prior. And yeah, so as I was saying, this code created a special class of citizens in the USSR, and that was the Communist Party officials. The reason is that if you did a common crime against another citizen that was not a member of the Communist Party, then you would simply get tried under the common law, and you would have a relatively good treatment in the Gulag. However, if you killed a Communist Party member, then you would get arrested under one of these articles, the 58.8, the terrorism, and you would have a much higher penalty. Also, 58.8 penalizes terrorist intent. And Solzhenitsyn gives an anecdote of a man that was like he was saying, go to hell to a communist official. And because of that, he got arrested under 58.8 for terrorist intent, and he got sent to the Gulag. So you could insult someone that was not a member of the Communist Party, but if you insulted someone that was a member of the Communist Party, you could get arrested for terrorist intent, and you would receive a very harsh sentence. Yeah, so.
I actually wanted to add that very typically, it was enough to write an anonymous letter and giving some accusations of anti-government activity, and the person would disappear without any trial or some mock trial. It was very common, and it became often sometimes people used it to get rid of their enemies at work, at home, in a family, and very often because people lived in communal apartments, they would want their neighbor to disappear so that they could grab that room and live a little with more space. It was very common, unfortunately. So a lot of anonymous letter was enough to destroy a person.
Yeah. Yeah, so here I have an extract from, wait, yeah. So this is in the Gulag Archipelago. So there was no section in Article 58 which was interpreted as broadly and with so ardent a revolutionary conscience as Section 10. Its definition was propaganda or agitation containing an appeal for the overthrow, subverting, or weakening of the Soviet power, and equally for the dissemination or preparation or possession of literary materials of similar content. So this was the article under which Solzhenitsyn was arrested. And the famous extensions of this famous section were as follows. The scope of agitation containing an appeal was enlarged to include a face-to-face conversation between friends, or even between husband and wife, or a private letter. The word appeal could mean personal advice. And we say could mean because in fact it did. Subverting and weakening the government could include any idea which did not coincide with or rise to the level of intensity of the ideas expressed in the newspaper on any particular day. After all, anything which does not strengthen must weaken. Yeah. And then he said the term preparation of literary materials covered every letter, note, or private diary, even when only the original document existed. Thus happily expanded what thought was there, whether merely in the mind, spoken aloud, or jotted down, which was not covered by Section 10. So essentially, everyone was guilty. Everyone could be anyone could be arrested at any time for anything. And also, one thing I didn't show you is in Article 58, there is an article that says that helping the enemy in any way is an act that could send you to the Gulag. But that meant that every citizen of an area of the USSR which had been occupied by the German army was theoretically a criminal under this code. However, there were so many of them that not all of them were arrested. But when you needed to arrest someone that was living like in Ukraine, for instance, you could simply invoke Article 58 and say that at some point he had aided the German invader, whether by providing some supplies or having his home requisitioned by German army or anything like that.
A question that, do you think there was ever a point, you've indicated that Lenin was involved in this autocratic regime from the beginning. So was there ever a period right at the beginning where people really wanted to follow the philosophy of Karl Marx and Engels and all the others? And was there ever a point where they were really motivated by ideology?
Oh yeah, I think Stalin was motivated by ideology. I think most of them, not all of them, but here's the thing, like, I don't think the system would have been able to endure for so long if ideology was not a driving factor behind most of the people in power. So you could have some people that were in it only for personal gain, but I believe that those were the minority, because think about it, even Solzhenitsyn himself was so indoctrinated that it took the Gulag to deprogram him. Like, even when he was in jail, when he was talking to other prisoners, he was still defending Lenin to prisoners that had been in the jail for so long that they had renounced communism.
Yeah, yes, but you're describing actions that don't sound like idealistic communism. It's
You know, have you read, James, have you read Darkness at Noon?
no.
Darkness at Noon is a story of an old Bolshevik, someone who had been, a colleague of Lenin's, who's been arrested by the new generation of Stalinist functionaries. And the whole book is about their attempt to get him to confess. And the breaking point for him comes when he realizes that what these people are doing really is in sync with what they really were carrying out what was implicit or explicit in what his generation thought was a humanist movement. And that's when he said, okay, I can't fight anymore, I'll make a false confession. And he was executed. So yeah, there were lots of it's a question of the end justifies the means. You know, you can be very idealistic, but once you make the decision that the end justifies the means, then where do you go? Where do you stop? Then you go all the way to here. You know, how do you say, well, the end justifies the means here because I'm fighting for the revolution, I'm fighting for the working class, I'm fighting for mankind, for humanity. So the end justifies the means. And then you step by step, you end up in the Gulag.
Yeah, but also I wanted to say that even though the system, yes, started with Lenin and Gulag existed before Stalin came to power fully, because it took a number of years through the 20s for him to overcome the oppositions like Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Rykov, all those people. And Gulag existed, but once he came to power, especially in the 30s, there was like this whole system was put in a different gear. His personality added up to this. He obviously had a lot of personal grudges. He probably had some kind of paranoia developed. He destroyed, but basically he destroyed all the people he knew before revolution.
Right.
And that was one of the things that he constantly changed the regime of Cheka, which is like later evolved in NKVD, and then eventually in KGB. So we know KGB, but there were like few other stages. But he changed the leadership there, and usually a big portion of people who served there would end up in Gulag. So he's just like, he didn't trust, every time he changed, he didn't trust. There were many leaders, communist leaders, almost everyone who had any kind of position, you grow to, a power, a little bit powerful, that represented the danger. He probably had this idea of changing the leadership, the medium, high level, medium level leadership, periodically. That was his thing, probably led. So it went to the extreme, I think, because of him. I'm sure it would have been pretty bad anyway, but because of him, it probably, it's impossible to calculate, but easily it could be a few times more than it could have been otherwise.
So Greg, one of the points that Arthur Koestler makes is that it was generational. So he points a lot to the fact that the generation of functionaries in the 30s were people who never knew anything else but the Soviet Union. And the older Bolsheviks had exposure to a wider world, and they had exposure to an intellectual culture. But the next generation, the people that were born, Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918, you said, right? So he's 20 years old in 1938. Maybe people who are a little bit older and starting their careers, that they interpreted the dictums in a much more reductionist way, and it had to do with their youth and the fact that they had never known anything else. They didn't have an exposure to a more European viewpoint. I mean, the early communist movement was a pan-European movement.
Yeah, actually, sure. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people who went to the Spanish Civil War were prosecuted later on just because they've been exposed to the Western ideas. That's another example.
There's something about the Gulag system. I mean, it seems to be also, you're describing a system where the whole economy relies on the Gulag system.
On the slave labor, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's very common. That's been during the Tsarist time. The peasantry was official slavery.
What sort of work did they do in the Gulag?
Building, mining, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Forest was a major, similar things. The Soviet Union is a great territory, a lot of natural resources. Forest is a very famous resource. People needed wood, and mining, and maybe doing some manufacturing, things like that.
I read somewhere, I can't remember.
Railroads, big time.
Yeah, I remember, I read something and I can't remember where it was, but the point that they made was that in the camps, the prisoners who were there for common crimes were actually kind of almost deputized.
Yes.
To basically to bully and to be the first level of torturing of the political prisoners.
Yeah, it's in any camp. You always have local small leaders. It's like almost like an army. You have
but these were prisoners. These were prisoners who were
right.
Who were,
yes, yeah. Like, it was better for you to have killed someone than to have sent a letter critical of Stalin.
But my
Yeah.
point is not just that they were treated better, but that they were recruited to be part of the mechanism of oppressing the
Yeah.
political prisoners.
Because
Yeah.
they were
served-
seen
they
as
served
class
the regime.
allies. Yeah.
And by the way, in the book, he actually describes that sometimes they, in order to make life harder for political prisoners, who were often intellectuals, they will put them together with the hardened criminals, and you can imagine what would happen. They totally disrespected them and beat them up and humiliated them. That was like the guards did it on purpose, because they wanted to humiliate political prisoners. They were no match for, murderers. It's another world. I mean, in those real criminals, I'm talking about the thieves. There was a special code of honor for thieves. I don't know if you all the tattoos had a certain scheme. By tattoo, you had certain ranks. It's basically your whole history is in your tattoos on your body. Who this person is, what kind of standing it has in a underworld, I'd say, and those people had a lot of respect. They also had their own laws, and but they certainly political prisoners were not part of their system, so they were open to any kind of abuse. Okay, Adrian. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
I just want to read this passage because I think it's very interesting. So in this passage, Solzhenitsyn is saying that the caricature of evil people that we see in plays and movies is wrong, because evil people are not people that delight in killing others. And so here he says, no, that's not the way it is. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that he is doing good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it is in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is, the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity, the conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, and the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. How then do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? And who was it that destroyed these millions? Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. So ideology is key to understanding the USSR. It would have been impossible, I think, to have a system so evil stand only for the material benefits of the people that were at the top of the pyramid. The system could only survive because of the willingness to suffer from the people at the bottom that comes from ideology. It's because the people that were being crushed believed that they were being crushed for a good cause that they were suffering it without revolting. Yeah, because otherwise, when you think about everything that happens, it's unbelievable that no one was protesting.
An interesting point is the point made by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is that she defines totalitarianism by the Nazis and by the Soviets as that there is no part of life in which the regime does not intervene to take control. There's nothing. There's no trade union. There's no sports club. There's no sewing circle. There's no book club. There's no sort of independent organization that is not subject to the intervention of the state, because then there's no place for people to meet and plot or just to commiserate with each other and get strength through numbers.
Yeah, obviously there was organization problems and also access to information. Like, it was difficult to know what was happening in the Gulag if you were on the outside, and it was difficult to communicate with other people to create a rebellion. But I think the regime held on for decades longer just because of ideology, because people actually believed that they were doing good.
Yeah, but also I have to say that it was a few generations that were terrorized, and I grew up after the Stalin, the death, so there was not the same level of terror. However, my grandparents went through this, and I was bred with it. So the population is naturally terrorized. You grow up terrorized. So there is a fear. And also the regime is so ruthless and cruel that any kind of protest practically means that you're going to be arrested and maybe spend the rest of your life in prison. So very few people who are ready to go to make such sacrifice, very, very few. Right now, for instance, we're talking about after a couple of generations after that terror, the situation is changing and moving back a little slowly. I mean, it's no near, but still, there are some protests. They're not as wide as they could have been, but it's mostly young people who have kind of overcame, didn't grow up with this. But even with that, there is no chance, for instance, like a person like Navalny, there is no chance for him to succeed in any possible way. It's just like you're talking, there are people who learn to survive the torture and don't, he's probably one of those people who would be capable of that. And because he is constantly, in a way, tortured by all kinds of things thrown at him, and he kind of keeps going. But very few people. I mean, it's much wider spread now, but still, it's not a significant percent of population. Most of the people prefer not to get involved in this, just lead their lives.
Yeah.
It's the problem with nonviolence, right? Nonviolence only works against a regime that is civilized enough to care what people think about it.
Yeah. Well, actually, this section I think is incredibly, I think it's ironic and funny in a way, but it's also very sad because it shows the mentality of the elites. Okay, so Krylenko on the right was a famous prosecutor in the USSR. And there is a section of the book in the Gulag Archipelago where Solzhenitsyn goes over his trials, and he gives a summary of each one of his trials. And Krylenko created the concept that the concept of guilt itself was a part of the old bourgeois way of thinking about legality, and that in the new world, in the class-based, in the classless society of the Soviet Union, the concept of guilt was obsolete. And what mattered for the establishment of the socialist utopia was only the political expediency of sentencing someone. So it doesn't matter if you're not guilty. If you are a kulak, for instance, it's the duty of the state to persecute you in order to bring about the classless society of tomorrow. And what's incredible is that Krylenko, after having said that guilt was an outdated concept, he himself got arrested during the show trials, and he was tortured, forced to confess, just like the hundreds of people that he had himself tried. And after a trial of only 20 minutes, he was sentenced to death and executed immediately afterwards. So can you imagine the life of this man? Like, this man spends his entire life saying that guilt doesn't matter, and it's only political expediency that matters. And when he gets arrested, he is protesting that I'm innocent, I didn't do anything, this is a sham, this is a parody of justice. And he gets
Did he protest?
sentenced.
Did he protest like that?
Oh, I think he might have protested, otherwise he wouldn't have been tortured. But can
I
you
think that he
imagine?
would be tortured under general principles. I would imagine that he had seen so much that he knew it was futile to protest. He knew that he's not going to get anywhere with it. He knew exactly what was going to happen to him.
But he was a
Because
Bolshevik.
He had done it. He must have been, I would imagine he was resigned.
But I think he was idealistic. Like, he might have seen his own arrest as being actually, this is a very good question. Let's see if Krylenko protested.
Because if you say that it's just a question of what is politically the best for the regime, if the regime decides that he is a political problem himself, by his own logic, he deserves to be condemned.
Yeah, but in the beginning, he might have thought that maybe he could overturn, maybe he could use his connections. That's a typical reaction would be, if I can use because everything has to do with connections.
Maybe connections, but not logic, not argument.
Yeah, not logic, but connections. He must have talk to this guy, talk to that. I mean, they could
more like begging somebody to come in and help him.
Yeah, he probably wanted to do that when he said he's not innocent. But I don't know what really happened, but it would be.
Who refers to Krylenko as the useful idiot?
It's me. It's I said that.
Because it's a term that's used, as I understand it, in Soviet culture, and it's what we heard. What the Russians thought of Donald Trump.
This is a minor point, really. It's there's not worth really digging into it. I mean, it's really a minor
Krylenko
point.
Protested, yeah.
Yeah, whether he
Krylenko
protested,
could be like the character of a almost an animated movie or a comic or something, because it seems so surreal.
Irony.
Yeah. Oh, and this is so this is part of what Solzhenitsyn said about Krylenko. So I think it's a summary of one of his trials. So the reason that fine points of jurisprudence are unnecessary is that there is no need to clarify whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. The concept of guilt is an old bourgeois concept, which has now been uprooted. And so we heard from Comrade Krylenko that a tribunal was not that kind of court. On another occasion, we would hear from him that a tribunal was no court at all. A tribunal is an organ of the class struggle of the workers directed against their enemies, and must act from the point of view of the interests of the revolution, having in mind the most desirable results for the masses of workers and peasants. People are not people, but carriers of specific ideas. No matter what the individual qualities of the defendant, only one method of evaluating him is to be applied, evaluation from the point of view of class expediency. In other words, you can exist only if it's expedient for the working class. And if this expediency should require that the avenging sword should fall on the head of the defendants, then no verbal arguments can help, such as arguments by lawyers, etc. In our revolutionary court, we are guided not by the articles of the law and not by the degree of extenuating circumstances. In the tribunal, we must proceed on the basis of considerations of expediency. That was the way it was in those years. People lived and breathed and then suddenly found out that their existence was inexpedient. So this is exactly Krylenko himself at the bottom. Yeah. Yes, so I just find that very interesting. Oh yeah, so here I thought I could read to you the exchange of letters of 1922 that will birth the Article 58 that I talked to you about. So, oh yeah, so it starts with a sentence that I thought was very funny. So, Vladimir Ilyich foresaw a time not far distant when there would be a constant rush of people to the Soviet Union from Europe, and it would be impossible to get anyone voluntarily to leave the Soviet Union for the West. And then it says, Lenin went on to express his principal conclusion to the People's Commissar of Justice. Comrade Kursky, in my opinion, we ought to extend the use of execution by shooting, allowing the substitution of exile abroad to all activities of Mensheviks, SRs, etc. We ought to find a formulation that would connect these activities with the international bourgeoisie. Yeah. So isn't this crazy? Lenin thought he needed to shoot people because they would be too compelled to return to the USSR. And wait, actually, the letter continues. So,
it's really consistent with Lenin all the way from the beginning. You know, in Lenin's early career, the kind of the prevailing notion of Marxism was that socialism was inevitable, right? That you would, that it was so much in sync with where history was going that the victory of the working class was a foregone conclusion. And Lenin was one of the very few who didn't believe that, and realized that you know that the revolution could lose, and he was always concerned with security and you know, never letting up against opponents.
Yes. Oh, okay. So this is the famous letter. Okay, so Comrade Kursky could not find a way to formulate the association of the SRs to the international bourgeoisie. So Lenin sent him a follow-up letter, and this letter is in the book. So, Comrade Kursky, as a sequel to our conversation, so this is Lenin speaking. Comrade Kursky, as a sequel to our conversation, I am sending you an outline of a supplementary paragraph for the criminal code. The basic concept, I hope, is clear, notwithstanding the shortcomings of the rough draft. Openly to set forth a statute which is both principled and politically truthful, and not just juridically narrow, to supply the motivation for the essence and the justification of terror, its necessity, its limits. The court must not exclude terror. It would be a self-deception or deceit to promise this, and in order to provide it with a foundation and to legalize it in a principled way, clearly and without hypocrisy and without embellishment, it is necessary to formulate it as broadly as possible, for only revolutionary righteousness and a revolutionary conscience will provide the conditions for applying it more or less broadly in practice. With communist greetings, Lenin. Yeah. So Article 58 is the product of this letter of Lenin. I thought it was very important to show this in the presentation because yeah, no one can argue that the Gulag was bad, but some people will try to say that Lenin was not to blame for this turn of events, but actually Solzhenitsyn argues that it wasn't so, that it was a direct line from the communist beliefs to the application of the Gulag. And yeah. Yeah, so does anyone want to comment? Because, yeah.
Well, you see, what I only can say is that when Stalin was denounced at the Khrushchev time, Lenin persona was inviolate, and that existed until sometimes probably around when Gorbachev came to power and announced this new glasnost. And then at the late 80s, people started to get some information. It was some open information. And then when the Lenin started to get denounced, and it was very painful for a lot of people because they at least blamed everything just on Stalin, and they learned a lot of things. I think from my understanding, yes, certainly, I agree that Lenin started this system. It was a continuation of his policies. I think that Stalin's personality made it much worse than it could have been otherwise. But it was very bad to begin with. I think it was it was really a big experiment, and Lenin, if you know, in the beginning, in the 1918, he established this what they call policy called military communism. So where it was practically, he said that the terror of proletariat is justified for survival, and that's what it is. It's a proletariat terror. And then later on, he changed his policy, but still that idea persisted, I think. So I mean, he is not blameless, definitely, for that thing. I can only say, they practically destroyed all it happened, similar thing what the Americans did with Iraq. They destroyed the whole administration, administrative infrastructure, and had to build it from scratch, so and they lost a lot of capable people that were involved in government. They've been like really, and this country was in shambles in every possible way, economically, politically. It was a chaos, and they felt that only like very strict militaristic internal policy can bring it to order, and never got out of it.
If we want to trace this stuff back to its beginnings, there's a policy that was called democratic centralism, which was what Lenin argued against the people who were going to become the Mensheviks before they became the Mensheviks, in which he proposed what was essentially a military organization for what was then called the Social Democratic Party. And basically the idea was that decisions are made from the center, and all members of the organization are subject to military discipline. And there was criticism of this among such people as Rosa Luxemburg, who was the leading German communist and the founder of the German Communist Party, and had been a co-thinker of Lenin before, and criticized him exactly on these grounds, and said that that from this comes dictatorship. Of course, not, that was kind of one of the reasons why she was considered somewhat tainted by the Soviet communist movement. They kind of picked up on some of her feminist stuff, but they never really were comfortable with her because she was outspoken and and identified the problem with Lenin and Leninism in 1914.
Yeah.
So here, let me ask this question. Is there any application of this to the current politics of the United States? What I'm thinking of is the idea that people now, I'm talking about the extreme left, critical race theory, the idea that due process is not really important anymore, that people who ask for due process are part of the oppressors. People have any thoughts on whether this has got more than just a passing resemblance? People even know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
I'm talking about the illiberalism of the progressive left, right? The fact that you can lose your job for expressing an opinion that is not acceptable to other people who are quote unquote woke.
You're
Yeah,
saying
I mean,
that you could lose your job if you express opinions saying, we shouldn't employ gays.
No. If you were to say something like Andrew Cuomo shouldn't be judged until there's the result of an investigation and we know what happened, as opposed to all the people saying, out now, believe the women, forget about due process. Or let's talk about what happens with campus sexual mores, where there is no due process for males that are accused of sexual
Assault, or anything.
Yeah, right. They can't. They have no right to confront their accuser, cross-examine witnesses. There's no due process at all. I'm very anti-Trump, but that was like one of the good things that the Trump administration did, was to insist that there be due process on campuses. And that was one of the first things that Biden turned around, brought us back to where we were.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that. I mean, Trump, of course, fired Rick Bright because Rick Bright questioned Trump on hydrochloroquine. Is that the same sort of thing you're talking about? He fired him for expressing a certain view.
I'm not advocating for Trump here. I'm just saying that there is this trend that's been going on in academia and is now spreading to in the workplace, where people are being demanded that they confront their whiteness, their degree of whiteness. They have to profess the fact that they are an oppressor, and if they don't do that, there are real solid repercussions from that.
Well,
Paul, this is Beverly speaking. I absolutely understand what you're talking about, and there are articles both in the Atlantic, which I would consider pretty liberal, as well as in conservative media, about what's going on in schools. And this has to do with feelings of white kids coming home, expressing guilt for being white. It's that the pendulum, and I think this is what goes on, and I don't know that I'll see the end in my lifetime, but right now the pendulum has swung so far And I think only with good conversation about the state of our democracy will it ever maybe come to some accommodation where in this very diverse country, we can have some common ground. And as a former teacher, I think the place it must begin is in elementary school with wee little kids and a really well-developed curriculum in literature, in the social studies, in history, that is as balanced as it can be. And it's just an insurmountable at this point struggle, I think, for everyone. And I'll tell you one thing: I wouldn't want to be a teacher nor a parent in schools today.
But I have to admit that I'm not following this at all. There is due process, and in the United States has good due process relatively to other nations.
Well, if I could respond to that, actually, in most work, it depends on the state, but in many states, an employer can fire an employee without any due process. It's at will hiring.
That is correct.
And
I would support that.
So this has always been true, and this has been more of a right-wing policy than a left-wing policy. So
Do you recall the employee at Google who put out his opinion that there was a reason why there were not more women programmers, and it created a furor, and he was fired by Google for expressing an opinion?
I do recall that, and this has been the law in this country forever, that employers have the right to fire anybody for any reason they want. And that's been a right-wing, I think that's been more of a right-wing program than a left-wing program. So I don't think there's any trend in this effect. The nature of these things has changed, but this has always been true. And of course, you talk about people being punished for their race. We've been moving, the US has been moving more towards liberalism in the sense, I mean, the Jim Crow South was the very height of illiberalism, where people just wouldn't get hired because of the color of their skin.
Yeah, but now it's the same thing, but in reverse. Like you know, the Biden cabinets that are picked based on the color of their skin. Like you know, the only reason he picked Kamala Harris was, like he said it himself, he wanted a black woman as vice president.
Well, I think you're going a bit far there, but I would say that I think the idea of having a diverse cabinet is very good.
And why? Why?
Because for too long this country has leaned to certain ethnic and other social groups. So I'm not saying that any one pick would be. You have to balance this. It's just the totality of it. If there was no representation of a particular group, that would be a problem.
I mean, just to come back to the communism thing, there is a communist group today in the United States, and it's Antifa. They have the same logo as the communists in Germany. They have an ideology that is quite close. Some of them are openly Marxist. And what really I think is very interesting is that
I wouldn't call them communists. I would say that they are classical anarchists.
I mean, what I think is incredible is that the awareness of the crimes of the Soviet Union is much smaller than the awareness of the Holocaust, even though in magnitude, the crimes of the Soviet Union were 10 times bigger, if you just look at the number of victims. And some people, when I talk about it, some people, they think that the people in the USSR were not arrested just for who they are. And that makes a qualitative difference between the Holocaust and the USSR arrests. But that's not true at all, because if you were affiliated to a kulak, you could be arrested simply because of who you are. It's simply that class becomes the equivalent of race in a Nazi society. In fact, Nazism and communism are like two sides of the same coin, where instead of arresting people arbitrarily because of their race, you just arrest them arbitrarily because of their class. And there's nothing you can change about that. If you're born in a noble family,
it's not right.
It's not your fault. Yeah.
No, it's not. Absolutely, you're right. I mean, it's not right to have those differences and be based solely on that. But I mean, I can't say I'm not sure what we're talking about here, frankly, because as somebody said, in the United States, any employer has the right to fire an employee for any reason, except that we have outlined now certain reasons that are protected. That's quite just fine. And then if you go, so America is one end of the pendulum. If you go to Britain, you know, firing somebody is very difficult. It's a choice that as a nation,
but there's
nations have made.
I don't think that we're talking here about, you know, the prerogative of management to do what they want. I think what we're talking about here is that we have, in essence, a lynch mob of people that will clamor for blood when somebody says something that someone else interprets as being racist.
Well, but this
Oh,
isn't
yeah.
new. The lynch mobs had their height in the South in the early 20th century. The idea of lynch mobs lynching people for what they said is a long American tradition. It's just changed its targets.
No, I think it's higher. I mean, I think it's higher because like there's so many instances nowadays where, for instance, Antifa can attack journalists. Like there is this journalist that reports on them, and he got attacked in the street.
But that's illegal on many fronts.
But that's exactly what the Soviets would do.
Notice how the Democratic Party has really avoided taking that on and denouncing it. And look at the way for the entire last 2 years, the press would talk about largely peaceful protests, largely peaceful. So you had, you know, perhaps tens of thousands of peaceful protesters and, you know, 100 or 200 crazy anarchists, just like we had, you know, a few hundred crazy right-wing white supremacists who broke into the Capitol. This idea of there being two sides of the same coin, I think, is right.
Well, I think you're right. There are obviously differences. So the Republican Party has blamed everything on Antifa, and the Democrats tend to blame things on white supremacists. I mean, it's both sides. I don't see. It seems to me an objective, honest person would do is denounce them both.
Oh, people do,
and people do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but you know, if you were to watch MSNBC or CNN, you wouldn't see any denunciation of left violence, only right violence, and the opposite on Fox News.
Sure, and they should both. Well, this is just part of the partisanship. Yeah, America. I mean, the trend has been, and this is obvious, everybody knows, that there's been this dramatic increase in partisanship over the last, well, since I suppose Reagan was the beginning. Well, the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement was the beginning of the move towards this radical partisanship in America, and this split between the white backlash on the one hand, and the what shall we say, the liberal multiracial coalition, or the diversity coalition of the Democratic Party. Sure, and that's unfortunate. It would be much nicer.
That there are two different definitions of the word liberal, right? You have the classical liberal, and conservatives consider themselves classical liberals. The anti-Trump Republicans will define themselves as classical liberals. David French, for example, Jonah Goldberg.
Sure, but
what about protectionism? protectionism is a conservative policy, but it's not a classical liberal policy, like trade tariffs.
So I don't understand where that's coming from.
I'm saying
You're right, but the Republican Party today is dominated by the Trump. Something like 80% of the Republicans now support Trump. You're right, there is the old conservative Republicans, but they have very little power in today's Republican Party.
Right.
They've been forced out, yeah.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening to moderates in the Democratic Party.
Oh, Biden just got elected, and he's a moderate in the Democratic Party.
Look how Chuck Schumer, you know, the majority leader of the Senate, is scared shitless of OAC.
Is he really?
Yes.
No, come on.
No, I don't think so.
He does not want to be attacked by her. They're so careful to not want to offend their far left. I mean, that's why Biden is president, is that he finessed that really well. Now, I voted for Biden. I think that Biden is, you know, that you have to be insane not to vote for Biden. But at the same time, you have to see that he avoided confronting the excesses on the left because he didn't want to alienate them. He couldn't afford to do that politically.
Well, of course, that's the way politics has always worked. FDR refused to confront the racists,
You
the
don't have
Southern
to put
racists
it
in the
down there,
Democratic
but
Party.
this goes into the, with the towels that are.
But my point is that extremism on both sides accelerates, and the loudest and most strident voices on each side kind of prevail, and the majority who are, you know, let's say leaning right or leaning left or middle of the road, their opinions become irrelevant. It has a lot to do with media. It has a lot to do with the fact that if you want to get ratings, well, if you want to stay on the air, you need ratings. And if you want to get ratings, you want to get people upset. That generates ratings. I mean, I remember when CNN focused their camera on an empty podium because Trump, when he was still running for president, was going to come there 2 hours later. They thought that deserved 2 hours worth of air. And I think this is a real danger. And I think that in particular, the online world really, really magnifies this and makes it much, much worse. The most loud, the most extreme voices are the ones that prevail online. And they kind of bully the more reasonable, moderate people into going along with it. And then it becomes a question of peer group pressure.
You know, I also think like about communism, like I think the identity politics, like the belief that you are what your sexual and outer appearance is. So you are, before everything else, you are a person of color, or you are a white man, and you are defined by your sexual identity, etc. This is becoming more and more mainstream in the workplace. For instance, you know, the place where I work is literally just posting like each time there is an event like this, they post things about how we need to hire more of this particular type of person or that particular type of person. And we must make sure that the recruiting pipeline takes this into account. But
I'm very surprised.
I'm
very surprised if they said that explicitly, because
I say it all the time. It's they even like they literally sent a message to everyone asking them to give to, you know, Black Lives Matter and organizations that literally bail out protesters. Like now, you know,
but yes, but there's no hiring decision in that. If there's yes,
but it's
for
mainstream.
years.
Like if I was to speak out against this in my company, I don't want to take any risk on my job, right? So there's more and more people like me that they
really
feel
risking your future if you did that.
Yeah.
You know, I joined Citibank in 1981, and there was a PAC. You know, in the US was the PAC, political action, whatever it is, right back then. And I was rather surprised that Citi was asking the employees to contribute, which this is not new.
Yeah, but this is a rhetoric that is almost indistinguishable from communism. It's literally just you replace class by your color of skin and your sexual identity, and it's communism.
The kicker is that the people who are pushing this make the claim that speech is in itself violence, and that they are made to feel unsafe by someone else expressing an opinion that they don't like.
Yeah.
Right? And that's different.
No, that is different. The worst thing, I was talking to my dentist today. I mean, he's Chinese, and his practice is in Chinatown. And they're going, when they left the office today, when I left with them, they go in groups. They don't go singly because there've been too many attacks.
Right, right.
And it's disgraceful that how partisan it's become. And
it's just like in Europe, they tell Jews not to wear kippah.
Yeah.
Right. In Germany, that's considered, they just say, well, okay, don't do it. Don't wear it in public.
Yeah. I mean, this is also because there's no there's also this belief that, all cultures are equal and we should not criticize other cultures. But it's very apparent to people that are Jewish or Asians that if they go in certain neighborhoods that have certain minorities living in them, they are much more likely to be attacked. But it's not because of their race, it's just because of a certain culture that
which is
very
not to
present.
say that it's a much more dangerous for a white person to go jogging for a black person to go jogging, as we've seen,
right.
In a gated white community. That's super dangerous today, and people have gotten killed from that.
But there's this, essentially the cowardice of people that refuse to call out the obvious leads to more of whatever is bad to happen. And people are too cowardly because they would be losing their job. They would be, putting themselves out in front of the outrage mob.
The author, John le Carré, had a statement that he would use again and again. He said, in order to act like you have to think like a hero in order to act like a merely decent person.
He said you have to act like a hero.
Well, basically, he said, in order to be a merely decent person, you have to behave like a hero.
Because if you think like a normal person, you are never going to take action, right?
The requirements of being decent, of decency, have a very, very high bar. Even though we all think that we have an obligation to be decent, we don't think necessarily that we have an obligation to be heroic. But so his statement is, you really can't be decent unless you are heroic, which means making yourself a target for a mob, whether it's a left mob or a right mob, it's a mob.
Well, but do you think that decency requires you to stand up, and protest?
I don't know when and where you draw the line. I mean, I haven't been protesting, since I was in college,
right.
Or maybe for 10 years after that. I was very far on the left, and at a certain point, I realized that there were serious problems with positions that I took, and there's a lot of neoconservatives were all ex-communists.
Yeah. Well, sometimes this happened, but I mean, I personally grew up in the environment that created a constant aversion to any type of protest for myself. I mean, I other people, of course, can. So I don't ever would go to any protest for any reason, whether I agree or not, because I'm to me, I think it's futile. But a lot of people certainly have a right to go and protest. Whatever they believe, if they want
If there
to.
was a demonstration for the middle of the road, I would go to that, right? But that's the point. The
These
people
people
who
don't
demonstrate are
protest.
the people on the
The
extremes.
road.
If it's like you're looking for, for one of these impossible statements, you're looking for militant moderates, right?
There's no such thing. It's a
That's
contradiction.
exactly the point.
Well, it's a bit of
I
a contradiction, but you may remember that, I don't know if you remember this, Jon Stewart and Colbert decided they were going to organize a 1 million moderate march on Washington.
Yeah.
And
I went
of course,
to
showed up.
and their slogan was their chant was going to be, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? In due course. Well, it's a nice idea, Paul, but I think one can see the absurdity of it. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, but
No, I mean, in the days of apartheid, I mean, in London, when I was growing up, I was born here, but I grew up in London. We were protesting against apartheid all the time. And we used to have a sit-in outside. And one of them was outside the American embassy when they were not reacting well enough.
yeah, I mean, that's the problem, is that, there are righteous causes, but it's ultimately you get to this point where the extreme elements come to the front and they pull it in a direction of illiberalism.
Yeah, that's true on both sides. As I say, we've seen this polarization of American politics and society.
Yes, yeah. And so the righteous causes get swamped by the extremists who basically put themselves in the front, who get the most attention, who yell the loudest, who are most likely to get interviewed by the press because they upset people the most, and that's a good thing if you're a journalist.
I think that's true, but as a sociologist, I've actually done a fair bit of study of social movements, and the modern social movements really began with the civil rights movement in the South, Martin Luther King and company in the 50s and 60s, and that clearly was, I think, by almost any standards, that was a righteous movement, voting rights for blacks, and that was followed by the women's rights movement, wanting more equal treatment of women, gays, and the LGBT movement saying people shouldn't be fired and beaten up just for being.
Let me say something about the civil rights movement, because I know something about this. The civil rights movement policed themselves, right? The civil rights movement organized people so that if somebody did like what Antifa does today, they would have been dealt with by the civil rights movement itself. They would not allow it to happen. I was at the Columbia strike in 1968, and that was basically a situation where white students and black students came together. The white students, and I was one of them, were there to have a party, and the black students knew that their lives were on the line, or that's what they thought, and when they saw the white students partying, they threw us out of the building. That's the civil rights movement discipline.
Yeah,
no, you're quite right. There is a good deal more. That was a very disciplined movement, and yeah, social movements today.
Any other way?
What's that?
It could not have succeeded any other way.
It couldn't. That's because they couldn't ally. They had to be totally focused. It was a black male-led.
But
movement.
also they could not allow individuals to poison the water by doing extreme acts in their name.
That they didn't want. That's right. They didn't want any communists. Anybody. Bayard Rustin was a gay communist, so he was in the movement, but he was kept in the background because they couldn't afford a tax. Of course, the FBI was out to get them for communism, so they couldn't have anybody who was a known communism in a visible position. Now, of course, that's no longer true today. You didn't want a gay person. Now you can do it. Now you can have blacks and women's and gays and and immigrants and other people all joining forces. And at that point, you can't discipline these movements. I mean, the women's movement was, of course, criticized for being a white middle class, white educated women's movement. Now it no longer has to be. So the movements are more diverse. You get more, the movements themselves become more diverse and not narrowly single issue movements.
I think though that the movements are also more, I mean, we have a culture now that believes that you're doing something political if you hit a button on your screen and say like. You know, let's hear your voice. This idea of all voices need to be heard, and that this somehow is equated with taking a courageous political act. And the protest movements have no organization now, because no one wants to, because this whole idea of having disciplined planning, this is all passé. That's what the civil rights movement did.
But by the way,
did you hear about the? Oh, yeah.
I wanted to tell you a little bit of my experience, because I go to a lot of book clubs and they discuss, and I noticed, I mean, clearly there's a women's movement, and I have noticed that majority of women, I'm talking about educated women, reading women, you know, they feel so strongly about this, and they get so easily offended that they often resent major writers and major novels. They feel it's offensive to them, regardless that it's different times and different things. So I don't know if you read, I was really amazed. It's a Russian novel of considered to be one of the greatest.
Which one?
Russian writer, Mikhail Lermontov. You know, the hero of our times. I don't know if anyone read it, but it's a wonderful, beautiful story.
Oh, by the way, do you know that they say Pushkin and Lermontov was living like a rapper? They used to write, and they got killed by a bullet.
Yeah, but anyway, the idea is that most of the women hated him, hated the writer, hated the novel.
And these are the same people that are calling for removing Shakespeare from school curriculum.
Oh yeah, and Churchill.
Homer from school curriculum.
Oh, Homer, yeah.
Did you see that they tried to remove the statue of Churchill in London, and they had to cover it?
Really?
Yeah, because Churchill was supposedly racist against people.
Churchill was a racist.
Churchill but I mean, Churchill defeated the Nazis, right? Like, but he doesn't get any credit for that.
He performed a great service for humanity, but he also had some very unpleasant qualities.
So, even Abraham Lincoln, they tried to take away his statue.
That's hard to believe. That's hard to believe.
Well, certainly, if you go back, if you go back when there is racism and sexism was a norm. It was a way of life. Yeah. If you go back to 19th, 18th century, 17th century, then you have to disqualify and take out all of it.
That reminds me, you guys want to do something on gradual, I guess, the anti-racial type of thing. Maybe something like we can do Rosa Parks or something like. Recently, I listened to original interview of Muhammad Ali when he entered after winning an Olympic medal in Rome Olympics. He was interviewed somewhat 10 years later, and he said he won Olympic gold in Rome and came to New York, went to the most expensive restaurant and said, I would like a hot dog or a burger, whatever it is. And the waitress came to him and said, I'm sorry, we don't serve, African American. She used the word and he says, well, I don't eat them either. He goes, I only eat burger. I want a burger. Said, I'm sorry, we can't serve you. You got to leave. And that's the guy who won a gold medal for the United States, proudly won the gold medal, was embarrassed by saying, I'm sorry, we don't serve African Americans. I want to do a piece on that on the in our history club. So if you guys are interested, there would be interesting, something interesting like that to
It's interesting. And one of the things that you're talking about, I'm wondering if people agree or not. you know, is the arc of the moral universe trending to justice? Is it really?
What?
Lord Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe tends towards justice, i.e., the world does get better. And
I think that's true. Yeah.
yeah,
Over a long time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, for the one, you certainly can say
There it
that there's less poverty in the world than there was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess that's a good thing. I mean, in
The
relative
institutions
terms,
are
there's
better
less.
today also.
But human nature is human nature, and people can be hateful. And the phenomenon that you know that we've all seen of the extreme voices becoming the leaders is, you know, that's, I mean, you know, we talk, just think about it. Zach gave a presentation on Josephus, right? And the Jewish war against the Romans. And what happened in the Jewish war against the Romans is that the extreme zealots ultimately took it over, and by their intransigence totally destroyed the resistance to the Romans.
So I guess the question is, and the subject matter could be, are we really going to destroy the society by literally completely kind of eliminating what had really, you know, partially worked, so to speak, over thousands of years? And, you know, and we therefore shouldn't be this drastic. I mean, you know how many, I don't know, I'm obviously, you know, there's obviously, you know, good proponents of LGBT community, but right now the identification in the forums, you're, you know, man, woman, that's basic. Then they have transgender, then there's cross-dresser. There's like gazillion identifications now. And people don't know what to choose anymore when they, you know, try to, you know, identify themselves, and therefore.
It's only if they're confused, but if they're not, they do know. Come on. I
You have this
actually
idea
did
of
one application.
intersectionality, because the, you know,
It's true. I mean, there is a lot of qualifications.
on the extreme progressive left, it's a competition to declare who is the most oppressed.
yeah.
Right. So the
Yeah,
very worst
like
thing to be would be
hoax.
a transsexual African American with disabilities.
Paul, I would note that on the right, an awful lot of the Trump people feel that white people are oppressed, particularly white men. So there is a competition, but it's not just on the left; it's on the right and the left.
I think my feeling is that, and I tend to exaggerate, maybe focus on the left, because I feel that that's closer to my heart. You know, I mean, there's no way, I can't listen to Fox News. I cannot do it. It just makes me feel like I want to throw up. But when I see, you know, these people breaking, you know, in Seattle and Portland, burning a federal courthouse in the name of justice, they should throw them in jail and throw away the key.
Wait, so
Sure, absolutely.
Have you seen this? Like, can you see my screen right now or not?
Garden is for blacks.
Yeah. So this was in Seattle, you know. So they had, I think 6 months ago, they had a zone that was where the police literally fled the zone, and they had like an anarchist commune for a few months, and they literally segregated it in the name of intersectionality. So they had a zone reserved for people of color, and they also had a tax for white people. So if you came in, you had to give money to black people. And I mean, it's literally like, it's so progressive that it's literally segregation, but in reverse, where instead of giving the best spot to white people, you give them to people of color. Isn't it incredible?
Wasn't it, yeah. Ralph, you mentioned Martin Luther King. Wasn't Martin Luther King said, you know, in his I Have a Dream speech was to aspire to a day when people will be judged by the content of their heart and their soul rather than by the color of their skin.
That's correct.
And the whole,
but that was that was a day long off for him. That was not tomorrow.
And what I'm saying is that is precisely what's being rejected
Yeah,
in
today it would be
in
considered
racism
racist.
today.
Yeah. If you said that at Chaz, it would be considered
Well,
racist because
but
you're
he himself rejected that. He said, no, we've got to have action for black people. Black
No,
people need to be
said, no,
registered.
that's not right, Ralph. He said, well, he said they want to have the action for black people, but he said that his dream
His
is when
dream
people
for
will
the
be
future.
judged by the content of their soul as an individual, not
That was-
as a member of a collective based on the color of their skin.
Absolutely. That was his dream for the future. But that doesn't mean we have to, that's not where we're starting from.
It's
We're
not where
starting from,
but I'm saying that the idea that you reject the concept that people should be judged as individuals and insist that it's more important that they be judged as members of a class.
yeah, that's communism. That's literally communism.
Yeah,
It's
that
just that
is a problem.
you replace the class by something else, another class.
That's
being replaced.
explicit policy. That's not just,
That's right.
the
And what-
argument that's
and let me-
made.
and let me mention what followed that. For example, in the South, there were textile factories that were all white. And they said, well, we choose white people and black people don't apply here. They had their excuses. And the government said, no, this is clearly an example of exclusion of people on the basis of their skin, color of the skin. So we're going to require you to hire a certain quota of blacks in order to integrate your factory. There's no reason not to. They don't require, you have no skill requirements. There are clearly a lot of blacks in the area that not, so you have to move. There's no
Right.
excuse for, so you
Wait,
have
wait,
to
wait.
move towards a
Wait.
representative racial balance.
Wait,
And
wait,
that
wait,
was
so-
that, and Martin Luther King was in favor of that. He was in favor of giving specifically blacks a fair break so they were represented and they had a possibility of getting elected into office, of voting, and that required action in favor of blacks.
Wait, I just want to say two things, okay? So basically, the idea that segregation was ended by the government, but was perpetuated by business is false. It's not true because I'm gonna give you two examples, okay? So the first one is in South Africa during the apartheid, the government was mandating that there had to be segregation between whites and blacks, and businesses were illegally hiring black people because they were cheaper than white people, because they had been excluded from the workforce and therefore they were